Thank you so much for that really, really thoughtful lecture. I think if you need a lectureship, I'm pretty sure we can get you one at MEI. You have to do it on Zoom, so it's harder, but you know. And also between the Obsolete and the Utopian, I'm going to put a question mark at the end of that and then just set it for all my essays next year, so that's really helpful too. David's very generously agreed to take questions. So actually, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to ask if any of our students would like to ask a question before I turn to the audience. They might need some time to warm up, if I might ask you then. Would you mind just saying who you are and where you're from again?
I was in Tory for 36 years. I'm currently a Liberal Democrat. My question for David, you've been very eloquent about how the Conservative Party wins most of the time and the Labour Party loses most of the time. To what extent do you think that is influenced by the different ways that the two parties choose their party leader?
Well, it's nice to have a question that I have no personal stake in at all. So, I mean, look, the honest truth that I tried to set out there is that this is we've tried many different systems, and many times we've elected the right person as the leader. So, I hadn't really thought of that. I think there's a deeper set of structural questions in how the Labour Party was founded, how it conceives itself, how it's animated, how it does have these uneasy bedfellows of interest and ideology that I think it struggles with, and it struggles to sustain. One of the things I was going to talk about, but took out for time reasons, is that one of my colleagues in Parliament was Phil Wilson, who was the MP for Sedgefield. He took over from Tony in 2007, and he said one of the great tragedy was that, having reformed the party between not just 94 and 97, the references that were made to John's one member, one vote are absolutely correct, what Neil did in the 80s. The tragedy is that Labour stopped reforming the party on May the 2nd, 1997. And I think there's a lot in that. And so how the party became unrepresentative of the country, which is essentially the problem that it's had over the last decade, I think it has its roots in some ways in that. By the way, someone asked a question, what would be the, what's the clause 4 of them today in a previous session? Clause 1 of the Labour Party says it's about getting people into Parliament. No. Clause 1 of the Labour Party should say that it's a movement of the British people to help improve their country and improve the world. We're a movement, not just an election machine. And I think that's really important.
Thank you. I've got two questions over here, the lady, and then just behind her, the gentleman, and then I'll come over here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Agnes Arnold-Forster. I'm a historian. And you mentioned it very briefly, so I just wanted to offer you an opportunity to expand a bit. What role, if any, do you think nostalgia plays in the current Labour landscape, or even the left landscape?
Well, there's I think it's a very interesting question, and my answer is very speculative. I think there's something very striking, partly because I've lived in the US for the last 8 years. They really believe in their heroes who do great things, including on the left. Whereas the people who gain the energy in Britain are those who have heroic defeats, not those who do great things in power. So I think there's a real nostalgia gene. Now, I don't want to be, I want to add something though. I mean, this is not a Labour meeting, this is a meeting of academics, people of all parties, and that's a good thing. But when I go to a Labour meeting, I feel very warm about the other people who are there. And so I don't think we should confuse nostalgia with kind of being nasty. We should, comradeship should be it should be an important part of a political movement, I think. But I do think that there is a nostalgia gene that is very dangerous for Labour, both that it wishes that the world wasn't as it is, well, we can all do that, but the question is, as someone said, how to change it. But it's also that there's a sense that government and betrayal are fighting with each other. And there's almost a nostalgia for the virtue that is inherent in the absence of compromise, but the only place you can have absence of compromise is if you have no power. So I don't know if you're studying this in your as a historian, but I think it's I think it is an important part of the mold that we contribute to. And this point that we have a two-party system where one party usually wins, that's the problem. And nostalgia, in my judgment, is definitely part of that.
The gentleman behind, and then we're going to take some questions online before I come over here, if that's okay.
Hi, David. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, David. My name's Shafi. I'm a journalist. I specialise in looking at marginalised communities. What you talked about, combining the project and the policy, that really struck me. And the first thing I thought of was education, education, education. I actually grew up around here in Euston and Camden Town, and it's really interesting when you mentioned project and policy. Before Labour came into power, inner city London schools were the worst in the country, and by the time you left, they were the best. And although the caveat to that is that didn't necessarily equate to other schools in other parts of the country following that kind of experimental system of data sharing between schools. What I wanted to ask you is if there was a policy under your government that could be brought back, or not necessarily in its complete state, but revamped, repackaged for today's unequal society, what would it be?
Well, first of all, I grew up around here as well, and went to Haverstock School, and after 2010 became a mentor, or actually did some teaching in Haverstock School, and it was a very different school 25 years after I'd left it than when I was there. We had, I remember we had 21 steps to a 21st century education system, so it wasn't a policy-free zone. It was substantiating the idea that education was going to mean something. Now, there were bold parts of that, but there were also reforming parts of that. And the combination of investment and reform, I think, is a really important framing. I read this week that an experienced teacher is going to be 14% worse off in 2024 than they would have been in 2010. An experienced school teacher. And when I think about the way in which we invested in the teaching profession, we invested in head teachers, we invested in the London Challenge, but we also invested in associate teachers. I was schools minister for 3 years, and the biggest thing I did was to negotiate actually with the unions. The NUT refused to be part of it at the time. That the vision was that every teacher had an associate teacher in their classroom working with them, because you've got 30 kids, 25 to 30 kids, and there's a wide range of needs, and you need to try and personalize the education. You can't do that if it's just 1 to 30. So in terms of one thing to bring back, I don't know, but even on the Labour side, we still have people arguing, well, we should believe in social equality, not social mobility, to which I say we should believe in both. I mean, the answer to the age of meritocracy, to Michael Young's critique, is not to say, well, yes, equality of opportunity is the only thing that matters. You know, opportunity in one generation defines outcome in the next generation. So we should believe in social equality as well as social mobility, and education is the best tool that we've found to enhance social mobility, as I saw in my own constituency. So I can't think of one thing that, I think it would be hubristic to say I know what the one thing is that will change the schooling system, but I know that you can't, you know, if you want to, Jonathan Sachs used to say, if you want to conquer another nation, you build an army, but if you want to build a nation, you should build schools. And I still hold that very dear.
So there's an online question from Ivor Gaber. David, he says that he thinks Labour is not sufficiently robust in regulating financial institutions. So, was it a mistake to give up government control of the Bank of England? Topical issue?
Yeah, no. I mean, it wasn't the Bank of England that went on the spending spree in the run-up to 2008. So no, I think that was bold, and it was something we didn't put in the manifesto actually, for obvious reasons. But No, I don't think so. I think that it's a complicated argument because in America you had legislation that deregulated the difference between investment banks and retail banks, and you can re-litigate that. But I think it's a perfectly plausible critique to say that we didn't anticipate sufficiently what the debt burden was going to mean, the personal debt burden, not the national debt burden, and how that was going to play out post 2008. I think that's a good critique. Whether financial regulation on its own would have solved it, I think is a very, Will is here and speaking in the next session, and if we'd embraced stakeholder economics, I know he says that we would have saved ourselves a lot of trouble. But I do think we were complacent because of the growth that was coming through. I remember being in the policy unit in the late 90s. I mean, macroeconomic policy had moved from center stage in British politics to almost being taken for granted. And that's what Mervyn King meant when he talked about the non-inflationary continuing expansion, nice decade. And it was, I think the guilt, we should plead guilt, we're guilty of complacency.
Neil Nerva, councillor from Brent, recently re-elected last night.
Congratulations.
Thank you. David, thank you very much. I just wanted to come back to the point about party. And I was very taken what you were talking about project and thinking back to 97, what we might learn for the future about how party members appreciate that they are part of a project. And once in power, how agency can be more than just voting down a conference motion. What does agency mean when Labour is actually in power for the membership? Thank you.
Well, I think my view of this is very heavily conditioned by what I learned about community organising and community change as a constituency MP. And I would say that it's clearly not enough to say Labour members should take pride in what a government does for their country. It's not enough to say Labour members have got to get out there delivering leaflets so that it can get re-elected to continue to deliver their country. My hope would be that every Labour member, but not just Labour members, but the Labour Party in a locality is part of a local movement that is about making the community better. And it finds power sources in that community, it represents a power source in that community, it allies with the voluntary sector, the private sector, the statutory sector, the public sector in that community, and it's part of the living, breathing life of the place where you live. And I think that's where the challenge of centralised government gets in the way, and where you want a government that's actually enabling that rather than holding that back. Now, representative politics is an important part of this, but I think I can't remember who it was said, you've got to be a movement, not just a machine. And you've got to be a very efficient machine. I'm all in favour of being a good machine, better to be a good machine than a bad machine. But you've got to be a movement as well as a machine. And I think that's the interplay that is important. You're not a Leninist sect, you're not just an electoral machine, you're part of a movement.
Gentleman here, and then I think the lady at the back.
Could I ask a question about electoral reform? Because you skirted it. You talked about the big tent. And inclusive sort of politics, but then explicitly said not through electoral reform. But then you quoted praising the German coalition agreement, which of course is a result of that. And if you take the example of New Zealand, where they've had multi-member system under Jacinda Ardern, they have a very interesting trajectory. They started as a coalition and they've ended with a landslide, which actually would be quite a nice reverse thrust if we could have had that.
Yes. Look, what I was trying to say was that in 94 to 97, we didn't seek to resolve the progressive dilemma through electoral tactics. We sought to resolve it through ideas. That was the emphasis that I was making. Now, on electoral reform, I've got a record. I voted for the alternative vote when it came up in Parliament, and I campaigned for the alternative vote in the referendum that was so doomed to fail because of the way Nick Clegg negotiated with David Cameron and was sort of stitched up really for the electoral reform campaign. Now, my fear is that anyone could think that electoral reform is going to unlock the electoral dilemmas that Labour faces. So I think there's a debate about whether electoral reform would be a good thing for the country, which I think it would, and I voted that way. I think that's separate from the political question, which is how do we have a Labour Party that makes itself the leader of a broad progressive movement for change.
Unless there are any, I'm going to take this lady's question, which will be our final question, unless there are any students who have worked up the courage.
There's one
Excellent. So I'll take the lady first, and then our student can close the session.
The student shouldn't worry, but he is the sole representative who's going to have to be so brilliant that we all think.
They're all very good. They're all very good.
I'll be really bad, so you don't look bad. Don't worry. My question was about your sort of use of the concept of our enemy, and how it's not as simple as it just being about one, usually man. I just wondered how you would compare the way that we're currently reacting to everything that's going on in number 10 with how we reacted to all the sleaze in the early 90s. And I wonder if we could have reacted in a better way that might have... obviously, I think we did brilliantly in the local elections, but could we have done better if we'd reacted differently?
That's very interesting. I don't know is the answer about the short-term electoral tactics. It wouldn't be right to comment on that. I do think that the populist leaders that we're seeing, I don't like the term populist because it doesn't, the leadership that we're seeing from a radicalized right of politics in many countries often presents, and I really felt this in the Hillary Clinton-Donald Trump election, they present two targets. One, they promise or do appalling things as a matter of policy. And they sometimes, stroke often, do things that are personally appalling. And I felt in the 2016 campaign that Hillary was really sort of flipping between attacking the policy. Donald Trump's going to appoint people to the Supreme Court who are going to take away a woman's right to abortion. But then was almost in the same breath or in the same speech or in the same ad saying he's flip-flopper and doesn't keep his promises and all sorts of other personal failings. And it worried me that the dual attack, rather than reinforcing each other, they diluted each other. So my instinct is that you've got to play the ball, not the man, because it is usually a man. I just add one other thing. Remember, people have a stake, voters have a stake in a national leader representing the country well. But it's a long way from that to saying it's a risk to their own personal life and livelihood. But actually, what Tory governments do is a risk to people's personal livelihoods. And I always think you've got to try and, if you want to attack the other side, you've got to do them in a way that does actually threaten the lives of the people that you're representing and their own personality. There can be an indirect effect, but my instinct is you've got to take them on for the damage they're doing in real people's lives.
And sorry to make you carry this burden now to speak on behalf of all the student population for the final question.
I hope I live up to Queen Mary, the Queen Mary name.
We won't take your name and address to...
in your lecture, you talked about the importance of ideas in politics and for New Labour as well. And also, you touched on it just then as well, about the right not really having a good response at the moment to the changes that are happening in the world. So I wondered, where should the modern Labour Party turn for its inspiration?
So great question, really, really great question. And in America, they say that's a great question a lot. I don't know if you know that. And it generally means that when someone says that's a great question, it generally means they don't know the answer and they're trying to... but when I say that is a great question, I think it's a really good question. Look, I was very struck by this... it sounds like esoteric in a way, but I was very struck by this German coalition agreement because the individual party manifestos were unutterably boring. Right, the Liberal Manifesto, the Green Manifesto, and the Social Democrat Manifesto. They come together in a 180-page document, and every page has this driving idea that the digital revolution and the climate revolution opens up the opportunity for Germans to have more freedom and Germans to have more sustained prosperity. It drums through this every page with a real sense of project. Now, I've plead completely guilty that in the mid-90s, when we wanted an idea for associate teachers or for a college of head teachers or welfare to work schemes or tax credits, it's one thing to announce a policy. If you say it's being implemented in this other country, and here's Mrs. Jones from somewhere else who's actually benefiting from it, a housing policy or a jobs policy, whatever, it carries that much more weight. Now, it's also the case, we were less able to do this in the 90s, but I think we can do it more now. In our own country, in local government, people's lives are being changed. I mean, Nick Forbes is no longer the leader of Newcastle City Council, which is, worries me about the state of the party, because he was deselected. But under unbelievable austerity, the 60% cut in income for in revenue for Newcastle City Council. He's implemented over the last 8 years an incredibly progressive set of changes that have not just mitigated the damage of a Tory government, but really helped people who live in Newcastle. It's 12 miles along the river from South Shields, so I know it a bit. That's where I think we'll find a lot. We don't just have to look to Germany. I think we can look to local government in our own country for real inspiration about how to make change. It's not austerity socialism, that isn't the right way of thinking about it, but this point that the tax take is at the highest level since 1949 means we've got to think in really ingenious ways about how to spend money in a way that, public money, that has a real multiplier effect. And so that's where I would look, and the people that I meet from Labour local government are absolutely brilliant. I mean, really, really exciting, and getting Georgia Gould in Camden, Philip's daughter, fantastic leader of the council and really driving the borough forward.
Thank you very much. So I think we're going to leave it there. David's still on New York Times, who really needs a coffee, and I'm sure you all do too. It just remains for me to thank David Miliband very much, and I'm sure you'll all join me in doing so.
Thank you.